Hi, I'm Robert DiLutis. I'm the Principal Clarinetist of the Indianapolis Symphony. And on the upcoming concert, I will be playing the Copland Clarinet Concerto. It's one of my favorite works written for the clarinet. I was introduced to the piece by my teacher way back in 1984 or 5, and because he had actually been a friend of Benny Goodman, who the piece was written for. And in the late 1940s, when it was written, Goodman had been given the music and looked at it, and it's been said by many people that he complained that the piece was so difficult. And so there were actually 3 or 4 different versions of this piece given to him by Copland. But he came to my teacher one day and knocked on the door at Carnegie Hall and said, "Dave, can you play this for me? Can you make a recording of this?" And so he actually did record the piece and gave Goodman a recording of the piece, and I have a recording of that in which he gave to Benny Goodman. So there was lots of back things behind the scenes going on back then when they were working on this piece.
So this is Robert DiLutis, the clarinetist. To introduce him again, I'm David Srebnik, and this is Symphony Notes, a production of the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra. We know Copland, the Brooklyn cowboy with the East European background, and yet he's largely responsible for what we consider the American classical music soundscape. And Copland was many things. We know him for his ballet music and that jaunty style and the Purple Mountains majesty. But this work, especially at the beginning, shows off another side to Aaron Copland. Can you talk about what happens from the very beginning and maybe go through that first just page and a half, this other essence or Copland sensibility?
Yeah, it's interesting, and maybe because Copland was traveling when he was writing this or missing home, but he writes in that first page and a half, like you said, dreamy, calm. He keeps telling the player to be smooth and basically take your time, and yet at the same time he writes incredibly difficult, large intervals that require a lot of control to be smooth. So I'm not sure what he was thinking about, but the piece does sort of have a standard form that he used, but that opening was something different from what clarinetists were used to.
He was always, as you mentioned, very specific for instructions. And the one thought that that Copland references over and over is, don't emote. Mm-hmm. It's all there. It's very clear exactly what I want. You don't have to overdo. You don't have to oversell. That's always stayed with me. And I mention that because there's this, I wouldn't call it a controversy, but there's a section in the work where it sounds like jazz. And I don't want to give away the surprise, but there's a string bass involved. And it, in a sense, comes out of nowhere. And so, the age-old question is it jazz? Is it Copland? I've heard clarinetists say, well, Aaron Copland told me it's not jazz. And then I've heard clarinetists say, he said, oh, of course it's jazz. So break the tie.
It's a good question, and I pose that exact question to my students, and I say, is it or is it not? And I think the most important factor to decide when you approach the piece is, are you going to approach it like a jazz work, or are you going to approach it like a classical work? And you can decide, but whichever one you do, you have to commit to it 100%. Because if you commit to it as a classical work and you're going to try to jazz it up here and there, usually what it sounds like is a classical musician trying to be jazzy in a really bad way. And so I think, Benny Goodman approached it very seriously. He took lessons with David Weber, my teacher. He took lessons with Simeon Bellison, that was Weber's teacher. He wanted to be a strict classical musician when he played classical music. Unfortunately for Goodman, he couldn't get that out of his system. He'd been playing jazz for so long that even when he plays the Mozart quintet, he almost jazzes up the first entrance of the clarinet. It's just slightly uneven in that jazzy kind of way. So for me, though, I approach it as a strictly classical piece. And that's the way, actually, the premiere of the piece, done by Ralph McLean, he approached it that way too. It was a strictly classical work, premiered by the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1950.
So it's interesting. Again, you can approach it like a classical work, and if you follow Copland's instructions to the letter, it is possible, even though you're approaching it from a classical standpoint, that the composer has created something jazz-like, and maybe that's the answer to the riddle. Thank you for talking to us. Robert DiLutis plays the Concerto for Clarinet by Aaron Copland of the next concert by the Annapolis Symphony Orchestra. I'm David Srebnik. Tickets are available at annapolissymphony.org. Thank you, and thank you.